The West Wall near Aachen, Germany, October 1944. First Lieutenant Heinrich Brandt had spent 3 years of his engineering career inside the West Wall, building it rather than fighting from it. He was one of several hundred Reichsarbeitsdienst engineering supervisors assigned to reinforce the West Wall in 1939, holding responsibility for quality control on a stretch of bunkers running 12 kilometers southeast of Aachen. He had watched that concrete pour. He had personally measured walls 2 meters thick and 3 meters on exposed positions. He tested the steel embrasure frames himself, verifying their tight tolerances against heavy specifications engineered to absorb direct hits from the heaviest Allied artillery of the era. He had signed documents certifying these fortifications would hold. Now he stood looking at one of them. The bunker before him was breached. It was not destroyed or totally obliterated by a heavy bomb or point-blank artillery fire. Instead, it was simply breached. American engineers had blown a hole right through the rear wall. The embrasure was choked with rubble and the charred remains of a flamethrower attack. The heavy steel door lay blasted off its frame. The defenders inside were gone, either captured or dead. He did not know which. He circled the fortress twice, studying the damage with the intense focus of the man who had certified its strength. Then he circled it a third time. For several minutes, he could not fathom what specialized equipment had shattered a wall he had personally guaranteed. When his own engineers finally brought him the answer, it became the single most chilling revelation of his entire war. There had been no specialized equipment at all, none whatsoever. If we look closer, the Siegfried Line was no makeshift defense. It was a massive, deliberate, military construction project in German history. Conceived in the mid-1930s as Hitler's answer to French strategic depth, it began in earnest in 1938, when accelerating German rearmament made a Western line militarily necessary. At its building peak in 1938 and 39, over 500,000 workers, soldiers, and conscripts, laborers, and civilian contractors were working on it simultaneously in what Goebbels' propaganda machine called the greatest building project since the medieval cathedrals. And that description was not entirely wrong. In raw materials alone, the West Wall consumed nearly 8 million tons of concrete and 3.5 million tons of steel over its construction, more concrete than Germany's entire civilian construction sector used in those same years. The result stretched over 630 kilometers from Cleve in the north to Wam-Rin in the south, containing approximately 18,000 individual fortifications of various types, bunkers, gun casemates, observation posts, command centers, troop shelters, and ammunition storage facilities. Every single fortification was built to strict standards. The active fighting bunkers, those positions from which infantry and artillery crews fought, were designed to survive direct hits from heavy Allied artillery, including the 155mm howitzer, the heaviest standard weapon in America's inventory. Their front walls were poured to at least 2 meters thick, with exposed faces reaching 3 meters or more. The concrete mix specifications were engineered for maximum strength, while heavy steel reinforcement was calculated to prevent spalling the lethal fragmentation of concrete that could kill crews even when the structure itself remained standing. The obstacles protecting those bunkers, the famous dragon's teeth, had a formal name, hook or hinderness, and were engineered with equal precision. These concrete pyramids stood between 1 and 1.5 meters high. Arranged in rows 4 to 5 ranks deep, they were designed and tested against Allied armor. By 1938, the spacing between individual concrete teeth was precisely calibrated to prevent tank tracks from gaining traction. Their height was calculated to high center any tank attempting to cross over them. The depth of the belt, sometimes 30 meters deep, was intended to deny any running start. Behind those obstacles, covering the open fields, the bunkers waited. German engineers reviewing the completed West Wall in 1940 estimated it would require months of siege operations, specialized gap crossing, equipment, and purpose-built bunker reduction tools to breach in any systematic way. They had built their confidence on the specific assumption that no enemy army would attack without the heavy engineering machinery this problem obviously required. Yet, this was the exact assumption the arriving American army was about to shatter in September 1944. Subscribe to our channel to find out how, because that first assault on the Siegfried Line came faster than anyone on either side had anticipated. Following the spectacular collapse of German resistance in France, after the Normandy breakout, weeks of rapid pursuit saw American armored columns cover ground so quickly that German units were captured before they even knew which direction to retreat. The question of the West Wall started to seem almost theoretical to some American headquarters. Germany's Western Army was utterly shattered. Their reserves were exhausted, and their command structure lay in ruins. When Allied scouts probed the first Siegfried Line positions in early September 1944, entire stretches of the fortifications were nearly unmanned, guarded only by thin skeleton forces of elderly reservists, Luftwaffe ground, crews forced into infantry roles, and rear support troops who never expected to face combat. The 5th Armored Division punched the first hole in the Siegfried Line on September 11, 1944, near Wallendorf in Luxembourg. They did it without specialized equipment or any fancy, purpose-built bunker-busting machinery. Instead, they used standard armored division tools, blasting tank guns at close range alongside combat engineers, wielding demolition charges. They relied on the pure momentum of a force that had been running hard for so long that stopping felt completely unnatural. The breach was narrow, heavily contested, and ultimately sealed by German reserves before it was exploited. But breaching a defensive line, once deemed utterly impassable, sent a massive shockwave through the American high command, forever shaping how future, more deliberate assaults on the West Wall would be planned. The message was clear. It can be done using only the tools we already have. This was not what German defensive planners had anticipated. Their own professional calculations led them to expect that any serious American attempt to crack the West Wall would have to wait for specialized engineering gear to reach the front. They expected to see purpose-built gap-crossing vehicles, heavy demolition machines designed for reinforced concrete, and specialized armored breaching vehicles, like those developed by the British 79th Armored Division, the famous Hobart's Funnies. These included the AVRE, whose massive petard mortar was specifically designed to shatter heavy bunkers. But the Americans had declined to build an equivalent force, a choice made early in the war when military doctrines were first set. British engineers saw this as a massive gap in American capabilities that would force them to improvise at the West Wall. Yet, the resulting field tactics were so incredibly effective they redefined how historians look at the balance between custom machinery and raw soldier ingenuity. The American method for cracking West Wall bunkers was refined during the autumn 1944 battle for Aachen, earning a legendary name that swept through the engineers and infantry of the 1st United States Army with the speed of any truly vital combat hack. They called it the Blowtorch and Corkscrew. The blowtorch meant a flamethrower, the corkscrew, a satchel charge. The sequence was simple. A concrete bunker presented 3 critical challenges to attacking infantry. First, thick concrete walls resisted the direct fire of standard tank guns and artillery at the close ranges where support weapons had to operate. The 75 and 76 millimeter guns carried by most American tanks could only chip and crack the thick concrete, failing to reliably penetrate several meters of reinforcement. Second, let's look at the bunker embrasures. Those narrow firing slits sliced into the concrete, which let defenders pin down advancing troops from complete safety while the infantry crossed open ground. Third, the heavy steel door at the rear was the garrison's escape route and the attacker's best entry, but it was also the most heavily reinforced exterior point. The flamethrower solved that second problem. An M2 flamethrower, with a range of 20 to 40 meters and 7 seconds of continuous fuel, blasted liquid fire straight into or across the bunker's narrow firing slits. Facing a sudden roaring jet of burning napalm through their own firing ports, the defenders had only 2 choices. Retreat deep inside or die where they stood. Crucially, the fire did not need to break the concrete. It only needed to reach the opening. Standard gear. No special engineering required. Once the garrison was suppressed and pushed back, combat engineers rushed the steel rear door. Today, you and I can see that west wall bunkers, though massive, had a fatal flaw. Their heavy hinges and locking mechanisms were incredibly vulnerable to standard military demolition techniques. Combat engineers were routinely trained to destroy them using simple TNT or C2 satchel charges. Placed properly against the doorframe, these explosives created a pressure wave the steel doors could not absorb. The doors flew off, the infantry rushed inside, and the fortification was completely cleared out. Interestingly, neither the satchel charge nor the M2 flamethrower were custom-built for this operation. They were standard-issue tools used by American forces for everyday combat scenarios. Every single combat engineer was trained to use these charges for a variety of tasks. From clearing obstacles to blowing up enemy equipment, Germany's certified concrete wall met its match. These standard American tools existed long before anyone had ever heard of the Siegfried Line. The German response was to reinforce the doors, install baffles in the embrasures, and deepen their defensive belts. These obstacles were built specifically to stop Allied troops from flanking their heavy concrete fortifications. Yet the Americans adapted, bringing up heavily armed tank destroyers to fire directly at the bunkers. They deployed massive bulldozers to clear paths through the obstacles and kept pushing forward. The Dragon's Teeth defenses presented a unique technical challenge, requiring a very different kind of solution. Let's look closely at how this battle highlighted the gap between theory and actual battlefield reality. The German Hooker Hinderness barrier was designed to halt armored advances. In that narrow sense, it worked. Any standard Sherman tank attempting to drive directly over these rows of concrete teeth would quickly get high-centered, losing all traction, and becoming an easy target for enemy gunners. German defensive planners had thoroughly tested these obstacles against the exact tanks in the Allied arsenal. On paper, they certified the concrete line as completely impassable to any armored offensive. The Americans did not have specialized bridge-laying or ramp-deploying equipment with them. Unlike the specialized gear developed by the British 79th Armored Division, they relied on something else. They deployed a tool the German engineers completely ignored, a standard Caterpillar D7 bulldozer. This was not a military vehicle, but a heavy commercial tractor built in Peoria, Illinois. Bought in massive quantities by the Army Corps of Engineers for general construction duties, like grading airfields and clearing heavy debris, it was a common sight across America. These machines were driven by the same working-class men who ran heavy equipment before the war. Many of these skilled operators had been driving heavy bulldozers since they were teenagers. What a D7 could do with its steel blade lowered at full speed was something German test engineers never anticipated. The barriers were only designed to stop tanks. Tracked combat vehicles had fixed hull shapes and suspension limits, but a bulldozer was different. It carried a massive blade designed to move heavy earth and shatter concrete. The operator had no weapons to fire. He simply approached the teeth at an angle, shoving the concrete pillars sideways one by one to clear a path. The work was slow. It was incredibly loud, making the slow tractor a massive target for nearby enemy defenses. The men who drove D7s against the line in 1944 knew they were highly exposed targets. They sat out in the open, protected only by the thin steel of a civilian cab. Engineer casualties during these Siegfried Line operations were devastating. Yet they kept driving anyway, because without a clear gap, the infantry had no armored support on the battlefield. Attacking heavily fortified concrete bunkers without tanks was nothing short of a suicide mission. But the gaps were made. Tanks rolled through to support the advancing soldiers. We see them reuniting on the other side, brought together by a simple runway tractor. A civilian machine built to level dirt airport runways had just broken the line. They found massive concrete blocks shoved sideways. Hit like and subscribe to support the channel. The defensive line was breached so quietly, historians had to reconstruct the method. The tools used were incredibly ordinary, so non-military in design that the German High Command assumed some mysterious, undocumented war machine was behind it, and the evidence overlooked. In October 1944, a German engineering report from the Aachen sector, noted that the breach did not match any known Allied gap-crossing vehicle, urgently requesting a closer look. Had that investigation finished, they would have found nothing more than a simple bulldozer. To understand the incredible feat American engineers pulled off at the Siegfried Line starting that September 1944, you and I have to look at the staggering numbers. This West Wall held 18,000 bunkers and obstacles, constructed over 7 years at the absolute height of German industrial power. The sheer residue of concrete poured into these defenses in 1944 exceeded the entire cost of building the famous German Autobahn network. Every single gun placement was chosen by elite military tacticians using the most advanced terrain analysis of the 1930s. Its tank traps were built and tested specifically to stop Allied armor in its tracks. The system was heavily upgraded twice, once in 1940 and again in 1944, right after Normandy turned the threat into reality. If you are enjoying this history, please subscribe to our channel. Interestingly, the Americans possessed no custom assault machines like those the British built for heavy bunkers. They had no specialist vehicles with heavy mortars to blast concrete walls at close range. No armored flamethrower tanks that could spray liquid fire from behind thick steel. They lacked bridging tanks or ramp vehicles customized to climb over the defensive concrete teeth. Instead, the American military sent 87 combat engineer battalions to the front, dispatched to Europe by late 1944. Each unit held 650 men carrying standard explosives, basic flamethrowers, and the common construction equipment used by the Army Corps of Engineers. Standing against 18,000 German fortifications, they relied on everyday construction gear and the sheer determination of their crews. During the hard autumn offensive, the speed of clearing these bunkers was grueling. The heavy fighting around Aachen in October and November 1944, before the Wertgenforest campaign, averaged only 2 to 4 bunkers daily per assault battalion. While this was far slower than the rapid advance across France that came before, it was still much faster than German commanders ever thought possible without specialized assault gear. Their assumptions were based on outdated reports of Allied engineering capabilities from 1943. They failed to anticipate how quickly these soldiers would adapt once they faced the obstacles firsthand, inventing clever tricks on the fly. They used improvised tactics, creative lateral bulldozer maneuvers, and direct-fire tank destroyers to crack the concrete defenses, sharing these ideas under fire, through informal networks, bypassing official command channels to spread these life-saving tactics horizontally. Now, as we look at March 1945, the Allied forces finally broke through the entire West Wall. The most expensive line of defense ever built by Germany fell to ordinary men using basic tools that any civil contractor in Ohio or California would recognize. The grueling history of the Siegfried Line is nowhere better documented than in the combat records of the famous 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, during their October 1944 assault encircling Aachen. By that autumn, they were the most battle-hardened American division in the entire European theater. They had stormed Omaha Beach in June, fought through the deadly French bocage, and charged across Europe at the very front of the Allied advance, supported by the legendary 1st Engineer Combat Battalion. These men had been fighting and clearing obstacles constantly since June 6th. They did not need any introduction to the dangers of fortified positions. Yet, what they encountered at Aachen was entirely different. If you find these stories fascinating, hit like to help us share them. The bunkers were massive and mutually supporting. German defenders, now fighting on their own soil, resisted with a desperate tenacity that the retreating, demoralized rear guard units back in France had utterly lost. The swift French campaign did not prepare them for this, yet their blowtorch and corkscrew tactics worked just slower against heavily fortified positions, and it cost far more engineer and infantry casualties than September's early probes had predicted. But it did work. The 1st Division's official after-action report for Aachen, filed in November 1944, contains a fascinating section on engineering. Let's look closer as it describes their brutal bunker-busting methods. With an almost conversational level of confidence, quite rare for typical dry military bureaucratic reports. It proudly states that bunkers thought to require heavy, specialized equipment were actually destroyed using only organic assets. No fancy tools were needed beyond what the division already carried in their standard kits, and the main lessons boiled down to timing and teamwork between flamethrowers and demolitions, rather than any issues with their gear. They were basically telling command that they had already solved the puzzle. They had everything they needed. Meanwhile, German prisoners captured in Aachen were being aggressively interrogated about their concrete fortresses and how long they expected them to stand. Several of the captured officers from the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, who bore the brunt of defending these West Wall positions, revealed a deep defensive confidence, but it was entirely built on a fatal assumption about American gear. They genuinely believed, thanks to their own engineering reports and high command intelligence, that the concrete would withstand anything except heavy, specialized siege machinery. If you are enjoying this history, please hit subscribe. So when interrogators revealed that these massive bunkers were crushed with basic flamethrowers and simple explosive charges, one stunned German officer actually asked him to repeat the statement. He had heard the words perfectly, but he simply could not make the professional combat math make sense in his head. The psychological blow of watching their legendary West Wall crumble without any specialized siege weapons was massive, and post-war records captured this with absolute clarity. Their disbelief was so profoundly technical that it produced highly detailed reports, far more precise than ordinary battle fatigue. Remember, these German military engineers were considered an absolute professional elite during World War II. The minds who designed and constructed the West Wall came from the exact same culture of technical expertise that created the V-2 rocket, the legendary Tiger tank, and those incredibly precise German optics. They were highly trained to solve tactical problems with calculated, tested, and officially certified engineering systems. So when the West Wall was finished, their technical conclusion was absolute and measurable. Breaching this defensive line systematically would require specialized equipment that the Allies simply did not possess. This was a cold, professional judgment, not mere wartime propaganda. These guys had done the hard math, but reality completely shattered that view in the field, as after-action reports, aerial recon photos, and prisoner interrogations began to build a clear picture of how the Americans were actually doing it. The reaction among German engineers was not just disappointment. It was a far deeper systemic shock. They realized their entire professional outlook had missed something critical about their opponent. General Hans Bessel, who served as a senior engineer officer on the Army Group B staff during this Siegfried Line fighting, spoke about this directly in his 1945 post-war interrogation. When they asked him about American bunker-busting tactics, Bessel admitted in records that he had spent several weeks in the autumn of 1944 trying to figure out what secret weapons they were using, because to him, any other explanation was simply too basic to be believable. The reality was that standard U.S. troops had created an incredibly effective bunker-busting doctrine using basic tools and regular training, rapidly spreading these clever frontline tactics across combat units faster than German intelligence could ever track. There was no secret weapon, no custom machine, just the standard infantry flamethrowers dating back to 1943, and the simple satchel charges that every combat engineer carried. When Bessel finally accepted this shocking truth, he put it into words that historians still quote today. "We built against their machines, but we did not build against their methods." This distinction is crucial. German defensive philosophy was purely hardware-focused, building massive concrete obstacles. American combat engineering, on the other hand, was a deeply procedural discipline, building adaptable methods while trusting frontline troops to improvise. These soldiers modified tactics in real combat. Meanwhile, the West Wall was designed only for static hardware. It was calculated, measured, and unyielding. It lacked answers for a strategy that adapted to every obstacle. These squads absorbed lessons from every battle, advancing to the next German fortress with new hard-won knowledge. They knew what the last bunker had failed to teach. Captured German engineers later confirmed this. Interrogations during the Siegfried Line campaign revealed a consistent German description of these American tactics. In every report, they used one word: schnell, fast. The Americans learned fast, and they adapted even faster. Before the defenders could recognize a tactic and counter it, the relentless American troops had already moved on. They targeted the next fortification. This rapid learning curve proved more decisive than any heavy weapon. As we examine this, the strategic impact at the Siegfried Line went deep. It went far beyond reducing individual bunkers. It completely reshaped the entire German military outlook. This altered their high command's plans for the final months of World War II. To the Germans, the West Wall was more than concrete. It was a vital defensive timeline. Nobody expected it to stop the Allied advance forever. Its true purpose was to delay it. They needed to buy time to stabilize other fronts and rebuild their depleted reserves. This delay would aid the V-weapons campaign, force political doubts, and allow retreat in the east. They hoped Allied political friction and battlefield exhaustion would eventually pave the way for a negotiated peace. This strategic plan required the line to hold for months, but history shows that was impossible. Berlin assumed the Allies would need months to design and deploy specialized breaching equipment. Instead, American combat engineers breached the outer defenses in September 1944. They attacked without waiting for the heavy machinery the German calculations had assumed they needed. This rigid technical assessment collapsed before the grand German counteroffensive could even get underway. These consequences directly disrupted the High Command during planning for the Ardennes offensive. He assumed the partially breached West Wall would still serve as a secure defensive anchor. When Adolf Hitler approved Operation Watch on the Rhine in late 1944, strategic assumptions were flawed. He believed Allied forces would hesitate to push through broken sections while facing a northern threat. This strategic calculation relied on the defensive line maintaining a strong psychological deterrent. They relied on a psychological barrier, ignoring that American engineers had already bypassed it. The Americans had repeatedly proven they could break these fortifications using basic, everyday tools. The engineers had cleared concrete since September. They mastered the method through raw experience. If you enjoy these historical insights, hit like. Allied forces never hesitated at the remaining strong points. They used flamethrowers, satchel charges, bulldozers, and direct gunfire to systematically destroy each bunker. The defensive timeline protecting the German southern flank vanished. Soon, Allied forces reached the Rhine. 3.5 million tons of steel, representing 7 years of construction. By March 1945, the West Wall lay shattered. 8 million tons of concrete. All this was breached, not by specialized heavy equipment as predicted. Instead, simple standard tools in the hands of well-trained, determined soldiers got the job done. They succeeded when advanced gear was unavailable. The fortifications were built to resist machines. But men arrived instead. Lieutenant Brandt eventually drafted a report. It was a highly precise document, typical of a well-trained officer facing uncomfortable truths. He detailed the breached bunker, tracking the exact pathways the Americans had taken. He recorded where they fired flamethrowers and the placement of their powerful demolition charges. These charges had blown away the rear door. Crucially, he found no specialized equipment. This was the sentence his commander underlined and passed up the chain without comment. He wrote that the work was, these tools had been in service since 1942. He ended with a warning. The destruction came entirely from standard issue, American infantry and engineering gear, done with simple tools by men who seemed thoroughly prepared to use them. Ordinary tools and well-trained soldiers. If you find this history fascinating, hit like. These simple concepts are easy to skip without truly understanding their true power. But compare them to 8 million tons of concrete, carefully poured across the German defensive line. It was engineered, calculated, and certified against a threat that never actually came. Those simple words tell us the whole story. Subscribe to follow more military history as we explore how they built this massive defensive wall with incredible technical engineering applied to a very specific problem. And that problem was defined strictly as hardware, enemy tanks, enemy artillery, and bridge crossing vehicles. They identified those threats, engineered defenses against them, and certified their designs against measurable standards. But they never engineered defenses against the American decision to train every single combat engineer, every soldier with a flamethrower, and every driver operating a standard bulldozer, or every private carrying demolition charges to deal with the specific obstacle of a concrete bunker. Fortification. This was not because German engineers were blind to it, but because their military command structure simply did not, at its core, trust ordinary soldiers with complex battlefield problems. Instead, it trusted the Basi machine. It trusted the system and the concrete. The Americans, however, trusted the individual engineer, not the officer, and not some specialized specialist with custom-made equipment. They trained each frontline soldier thoroughly, trusted them completely, and sent them forward with standard gear toward a wall built to last forever. Except it was not. No defensive hardware survives when it meets highly prepared soldiers. That is what the official report stated, written in the dry language of an expert who had just watched his invincible designs crumble. And that is what the West Wall, despite its steel, concrete, and 7 years of intense labor, ultimately proved.